Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we are going to take a look at the art and the philosophy of Bob Camblin. We've got a really interesting collection of material to explore today. We have a YouTube video transcript that delves into his painting Buffalo Bayou, and it looks at it with a Zen lens, which I'm curious to hear your take on. On top of that, we've got some of Camblin's own writing, some really interesting quotes and excerpts from his biography. And to round things out, we've got some excerpts from reviews and forewords from some books that featured his art. It looks like it's going to be a good one today.
I think so too. I think it will be really interesting to kind of go beyond just the surface of his artwork and to look at the philosophies that really underpinned his artistic journey. He was an artist who really beautifully blended ideas from Eastern philosophy with modern art. So I'm really interested to uncover how these concepts of impermanence, interconnectedness, and even just how we perceive the world, how those are reflected in his incredibly diverse body of work. And hopefully we can extract some insights from all this that might spark some contemplation in our listeners about art and life and the creative process itself.
Yeah, for sure. Let's jump right in. Okay, so we've got a pretty diverse set of sources to work with here. We've got the YouTube analysis that you mentioned that looks at his painting Buffalo Bayou through that Zen lens, Zen Buddhism that emphasizes things like intuition and direct experience and the interconnectedness of everything. Then we've got this collection of Camblin's quotes. Some of them are really thought-provoking. Some of them are kind of funny. I think we're going to have a good time going through those. And then, of course, we have his biography, which tracks his artistic development, talks about some of his collaborations. And last but not least, we have excerpts from these different books that delve into his art and the ideas behind it. Let's kick things off by talking about that captivating Buffalo Bayou painting. What did you think about that YouTube analysis, Bayou Reverie?
Well, right off the bat, I found it interesting how they described the Buffalo Bayou painting as this vivid yet tranquil waterscape. Right away, you get the sense of contrast, this duality that I think is really key to understanding Camblin's work. The video analysis points out how the light and the colors, the motion of the water, all work together to create this kind of atmosphere of serenity, even though it's clear there's this underlying energy to the water itself.
Yeah, and just from that description, you can already kind of picture it, right?
Yeah.
The soft blues, the shimmering yellows, the greens, all reflecting that interplay of light and shadow on the water. And despite the constant movement, that rippling, there's this underlying kind of calming rhythm to the whole thing. And the video talks about how your eye is drawn to that central tree and its reflection that anchors the whole composition, like a point of stability amidst all that movement.
Absolutely. And if we want to bring in Zen philosophy here, as the video does, you can interpret that central image as this sort of representation of the duality of stillness and flow that exists in nature. You have the water, which is constantly changing, very fluid. It represents this impermanence of life. You can never really grasp it fully. It's always moving. But then you have the tree, which represents this enduring presence. It's grounded amidst all that change. So the key insight here, I think, is that Camblin was really able to capture and express these dualities, these contrasting elements in these really simple scenes. Even in moments of apparent calm, there's this underlying energy and vice versa. And finding that peace, that stillness within that transience, that's like a core principle of Zen Buddhism. And I think this painting really embodies that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it gets really interesting because the video even connects the Zen principle of mu, or emptiness, to those dappled reflections on the water. And I know when we talk about mu in Zen, it doesn't necessarily mean emptiness in like a negative sense. It's more about the potentiality from which all things arise, just like the water reflects everything around it without holding on to any single fixed image. It mirrors, it reflects, but it doesn't cling. And that's kind of like a visual metaphor for the mind in meditation, right? Thoughts and emotions, they rise and pass like ripples on the water, but that underlying awareness remains constant.
Right. And because of this, the painting becomes more than just a simple landscape, right? It becomes this kind of visual koan, like those paradoxical riddles that are used in Zen practice to kind of push you to think more deeply and to challenge your usual way of seeing things. The painting itself kind of becomes a koan and asks us to consider these deeper ideas, these contrasting forces, like the seen and the unseen, the transient and the eternal. And the video actually brings in this connection to the I Ching, specifically hexagram 59, dispersion, which talks about the dissolving of barriers. And I think that's a really nice touch. It's as if the painting is saying, hey, let go of these rigid ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's not all about these heady philosophical ideas, is it? The video also suggests that the painting is a call to just really pay attention, to be more aware of the subtleties of life. Just as Camblin captured these really nuanced shifts of light and shadow in the painting, we can try to cultivate a similar awareness in our own lives, noticing those little details, those moments that we might otherwise miss.
Exactly. I mean, in this context, the bayou itself becomes this kind of powerful metaphor for life's journey. It has these moments of light and shadow, moments of certainty and ambiguity, and those reflections of the water, they're always changing, always in flux. And that reminds us that our own perception is kind of fluid too, right? It's always influenced by our own individual perspectives and biases and experiences.
Right. And despite that constant change and flow, there's still that sense of direction in the painting with that glowing horizon in the distance. It sort of offers a sense of where you might be going, but the journey itself is still open. There's still potential for exploration and discovery. It's like an invitation to really immerse yourself in the rhythms of nature and to embrace those contrasting forces, stillness and movement, clarity and mystery.
I love that. And the video wraps up with this really lovely thought. It suggests that we let the bayou inspire us to cultivate grace, openness, and mindfulness. It's about being present in the moment, harmonizing with the flow of life, and even embracing those moments of uncertainty as opportunities for discovery.
Mhm.
And, I think this all circles back to Camblin's own creative process. It's about trusting the journey, leaning into simplicity, and letting that interplay of light and shadow shape your own unique path. I mean, that's a lot to unpack from just one painting.
That really is. Okay, well, let's switch gears a little bit now, and we're going to delve into Camblin's own words and see how he articulated some of these concepts himself. This collection of quotes is really fascinating. You come across these contradictory statements almost, and they really make you stop and think about time, about nature, about art, about how we perceive things. What were your impressions going through these?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that struck me was that just how wide-ranging his observations are. He makes these grand statements like, fortunately, some things remain forever, another 10 years perhaps, which is just this really beautiful way of acknowledging both the eternal and the fleeting nature of existence. But then right after that, you have these very specific, almost melancholy reflections on the natural world. Like, there are no new branches on the cottonwood trees that were once there. It's this interplay between these vast concepts and these really intimate details. And there's often this undercurrent of reflection on the passage of time.
And you see this recurring theme of finding something in nature that completes you, but then also this idea of surrender. So it's like you find this sense of fulfillment, this connection with nature, but then you also have to kind of let go, surrender to it in a way. And then he goes on to give these almost like personal mantras, right? Like, the light is all you need, and the end is to evolve by doing the best you can. The means is to amplify what you're doing and believe. It's like he's reminding himself, reminding us to be present, to be intentional, to have faith in the process.
Yeah, like these are his guiding principles. And he touches on these basic human needs, the need for balance, for patience, for freedom, and also the power of silence. We often underestimate the power of silence. And then there's this really interesting idea about the purpose of art. It goes from this traditional art for art's sake to something much more immediate and personal, like art for life's sake, art for my sake, or art for survival's sake. I think that speaks to a shift in how he understood art and its role in our lives. It went beyond just this abstract concept. It became something really vital.
Right. And there's that quote about needing to step off the train of thought, to find a different kind of power, to do work that isn't really work. And that really ties back to those Zen ideas we were just talking about, right? It's about moving beyond the limitations of our logical, linear minds and tapping into something deeper, something more intuitive.
Exactly. And throughout these quotes, he plays with these really interesting juxtapositions, balancing and being, for and against, thinking versus doing. There are these little flashes of insight, like the one where he talks about the cosmos waving with tree leaves. Like he's capturing the sense of interconnectedness within nature.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are these moments that are just so human,
Yeah.
so relatable, like preferring to look at his watercolor palette rather than have an argument. It gives you the sense of his personality, his humor.
It does. And some of
Yeah.
these quotes are like little koans themselves, like
Yeah.
this one. White is light, black is absence of light, but people are seen. What does it really mean to truly see someone, especially when it comes to our interactions with each other? And then he directly addresses Mother Nature in one quote, almost as if she's another artist. It's a really unique perspective.
Right. And then you get these glimpses into how his mind works. Like he says, 5 thoughts crashed at South Belvedere And man, like these random ideas colliding, and then he follows that with a haiku. It's like his mind is constantly making these unexpected connections. And his take on optimists and pessimists and how he ends arguments with them, it's just so witty. He clearly had a good sense of humor.
Yeah, he did. And that observation about how arguing or agreeing might teach you something, but it doesn't necessarily communicate anything. That's really insightful, don't you think? It makes you question the purpose of our interactions and whether we're really connecting on a deeper level. And then this sense of always searching. He talks about being on this quest, but not even knowing what he's looking for, but still having this deep faith in the process. That feels like the essence of both the artist and the philosopher, right?
Absolutely. And he talks about the nature of change itself, making this distinction between revolution and evolution. And he suggests that evolution, true evolution, represents a much deeper form of understanding. And then he just throws in these little observations,
Yeah.
starlings on broken branches, a fish trapped by the changing tides. It's almost like he's drawing these subtle parallels between nature and the human experience.
And then some of his reflections are just purely whimsical, like that one about wanting to come back as a fly if you knew your body would shine in the sun. It's just delightful. It brings in this element of playfulness into these really deep thoughts. And then that really simple but profound way of defining art. He says it's not just images, which implies that it's something much bigger, something that encompasses so much more than just what we see.
Yeah, and he wasn't afraid to critique the art world either. He talks about this shift towards consumer art and the focus on shock and recognition rather than actual contemplation, and how concept was starting to replace these traditional standards of art. He saw the artist as this free agent who is only bound by their own desire, which I think is a powerful idea.
It is. And he talks about the power of belief, right? How belief shapes reality. And he distinguishes between just believing something and truly knowing it through experience. Like there's this whole other realm beyond logic that he's hinting at. And he emphasizes the importance of balancing our intuition and our logic. He even sees cynicism as destructive, as something that stifles creativity. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I found that interesting. And that idea that you can lose a certain magic by trying to understand everything intellectually.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes it's better to just know something on a deeper level. I think he really valued that process of creation, that heightened state of awareness that comes with it, more than just the end product. He even seemed to resist the idea of just learning. Like, he'd rather fail, relax, feel, and really think for himself.
Right. And that quote about how we all inherently have the nature of the Buddha within us, but we just keep forgetting it, that really brings us back to Zen Buddhism, doesn't it? It shows how deeply these ideas influenced his thinking. And even simple things like mirrors become metaphors for interconnectedness in his writing. And that distinction between magic for power, which he seems to view negatively, and magic for seeing, which he sees as a positive force. It's like he's saying that different ways of seeing the world lead to different kinds of art.
Yeah, absolutely. And he even acknowledges that even what we call real seeing can be deceptive. He describes it as this whirlpool of relationships. And he talks about how artistic novelty is fleeting in this disposable culture, and how the very act of trying to explain art might actually diminish it. It's like there's this inherent mystery to it that you can't fully capture with words.
And he ends this collection of thoughts with this hope for new intentions, for different forms of art to emerge over time, while recognizing that you can't just transfer knowledge without experience. And then these images of white and dried things evoking mortality, the passage of time, and those reminders about making the best of what we have. There are no mistakes, he says. You are doing the best you can. Mistakes are simply nature's way.
Yeah. And his thoughts on pride and that great analogy of the hologram, emphasizing cooperation over these petty arguments about size, the cycles of chaos and order, the concept of the hologram, which is like this clearer picture that comes from collective understanding. It's also fascinating. He even throws in these little thoughts about living in the past, present, and future simultaneously, and those metaphors of the hawk and the snake, which represent different approaches to life. It just layers upon layers of meaning.
He even throws in these little questions like, why was Louis Sullivan here? And reflections on different kinds of crutches we use in life, and that tension between futility and the desire to provoke something. And then that beautiful phrase, dolce far niente, the sweetness of doing nothing, and that striking image of the phoenix, frozen and unable to renew itself, waiting for the fire. And then this realization that the meaning we're searching for is like an empty ribcage. The real meaning is in the living being itself.
And towards the end, he starts engaging with all these other thinkers, right? Alan Watts, William James, Jean-Paul Sartre. He even mentions that old Zen proverb, those who know don't speak, Those who speak don't know. And he brings in Henri Bergson, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He mentions Jean-Baptiste Lamarck,
Yeah.
even Arthur Koestler. And he touches on some of their key ideas. It's really amazing to see him in dialogue with all these different minds.
I know, right? It's like he's weaving together this tapestry of idea. And he even quotes John Fowles from The Magus, talking about wanting to be something versus wanting to be liked, and the power of not having a plan and just relying on yourself. And finding justification in the present moment, and how we keep the dead alive through love, and the idea that we have to answer the most important questions ourselves. And then he mentions Dostoevsky's observations about unspoken fears and our strange fascination with strangers, and J.D. Salinger's perspective on art and perfection, and how the blues are often rooted in financial anxieties, and how we often don't know something until we actually do it, and that meaning exists beyond words, and that art might even cause a certain kind of unhappiness. And then John Updike and the idea that anything can be creative if you do it with care, and that art is this space for the human spirit, and the idea of striving for a metaphorical east of Kansas. And he talks about John Barth and the idea that value is attributed, not intrinsic. And Lawrence Durrell's view of art as a kind of compromise with the wounds of life, and how we fulfill our destinies through imagination, and how our inventions reflect our desires. He even brings in Aldous Huxley and the idea that consistency goes against nature. It's like he's giving us this whirlwind tour through the history of ideas.
He is. And then he brings it back to his own perspective. He introduces this concept of the ecology of art, which suggests that artists just doing their thing, however self-indulgent it might seem, actually contributes to the balance of nature. That's a really cool idea. And then these images that he uses, dissolving images, the turning wheel, that constant struggle to contain chaos. The goal is this mirage just out of reach. And that beautiful metaphor of drawing on a frosted window, representing these fleeting perspectives.
Yeah, and he talks about the frightening freedom of truly realized artwork and the challenge of creating something unique and lasting in this world of consumerism and shock value. He talks about how quality is fleeting and how concept is replacing traditional standards, and even how art might evolve towards a more participatory form. And of course, we can't forget his humor, like his take on being a teacher.
Oh, yeah. That was hilarious. And that final image of the ego following like a goldfish's waist folded under the waving tail. What a way to put it. These quotes really give us such a unique glimpse into his mind.
They do. Okay, so let's move on to his life and artistic evolution as we know it from his biography. So he got his early training at the Kansas City Art Institute, and then he received a Fulbright scholarship to study in Italy.
Yeah.
That must have been a really formative experience.
Yeah, sounds like it. And after that, he went on to teach at various institutions. But what's really striking is that in 1976, he just decided to completely abandon academia. He decided to live this nomadic life, totally dedicated to his art. That takes a lot of courage.
Absolutely. And during those nomadic years, he traveled extensively, and you can imagine how those diverse cultures must have influenced his work. It's also interesting to note that the book we've been talking about features his personal drawings and writings from 1950 to 1974. So these were works that he never intended to share publicly. It's like we're getting this really intimate glimpse into his creative process.
Yeah, it's like we're peeking behind the curtain. And the biography really emphasizes how his art transcended traditional criticism and commercial pressures. It was really about speaking to the soul, connecting with people on a deeper level. And it mentions how critics recognized the evolution of his style from those early Bruegel-inspired drawings to the development of these more organic forms, and his fascination with life cycles and how he really pushed the boundaries of drawing and watercolor.
We also learn about his early experiments with abstract impressionism, and then the emergence of his Musha Volantes style, which was inspired by Dada and surrealism. And the biography also highlights his collaborative spirit, especially his work with Earl Staley and Joe Tate. Together, they really challenged conventions, even the idea of individual authorship.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
It's like they were trying to de-emphasize the ego, which is why he often signed his works simply as anonymous. And that Musha's Volantes technique, that's so fascinating. He created these optical illusions that really encouraged the viewer to participate in the artwork. It wasn't passive viewing, it was an active experience. And his later work really showed his mastery of different techniques and his increasingly sophisticated use of symbolism and storytelling.
And ultimately, his legacy is one of inspiration, of challenging viewers, of influencing other artists. The biography also includes these quotes from different people who knew him, and they really paint this picture of him as this enigmatic, influential, and truly unique figure.
And there's that really touching remembrance from Earl Staley, who was his close friend. It talks about their shared studios and how Camblin eventually withdrew from the art scene in Houston. And he even stopped teaching. They had this collaborative project called B&E Productions and the Holding Firm, which sounds really interesting. And the description of his studio, this wizard's den, it's just so evocative.
I know, right? And then there's that whole thing about him adopting the Mr. Peanut persona and eventually embracing anonymity. And his decision to move away from Houston and limit contact with old friends, it all adds to the mystery. And it's great that people are trying to organize these posthumous exhibitions of his work. It shows that his art still resonates with people today.
It does. He really sounds like a one-of-a-kind artist. So now let's move on to those book reviews and forwards. They offer another layer of insight into his work. And one review of The Art of Everything asks this really fundamental question. What is art but a series of questions disguised as images? And it talks about Camblin's drawings as these paradoxes made visible, these blueprints for ideas.
Yeah, that really connects back to the whole idea of the visual koan, doesn't it? And the review goes on to talk about his exploration of illusion and those tricks and disappearing acts as meditations on impermanence, and his focus on traps and idea of stillness. And it emphasizes that the book doesn't provide any easy answers. It just poses questions and riddles. It makes you do the work.
And the foreword from Zen and the Art of Enlightenment, Volume 1, puts Camblin's work in this art historical context. It talks about how visual interpretation evolved from realism to abstract expressionism, and it connects these shifts to Zen Buddhism and the I Ching.
It describes Camlin's work as blending abstraction with symbolic motifs, like he's merging ancient wisdom with modern art. And it talks about his art as a portal to heightened awareness. It's not about passively looking, it's about actively engaging in this ekphrastic dialogue with the artwork.
And what's really cool is that the review talks about how archetypal themes emerge from his work, and they can illuminate hidden parts of our own psyches, and the idea that nothing is static, even our inner landscapes are constantly evolving. And it presents the act of interpreting his work and his writing as this personal dialogue that leads to a more intuitive understanding.
Right. It's not about forcing a single interpretation on the viewer. It's about awakening their own intuition. And the review really highlights the potential of the book as a tool for self-exploration, for psychological and even spiritual growth. Because it doesn't give you those easy answers. It's about encouraging you to find your own meaning.
Exactly. Another review describes the book as a guide to discovering enlightenment through art and language, and it calls Camblin's illustrations these strange, humorous, and unsettling koans that disrupt our thinking. And it talks about everyday enlightenment, finding beauty in the absurd and accepting impermanence.
And it emphasizes how each image and text in the book is meant to provoke questions. And the book itself becomes like a mirror reflecting your own mind back to you. And it encourages you to slow down, look carefully, and think deeply. It's about reconnecting with that sense of wonder and reflection. And the idea that enlightenment isn't this far off goal, it's something that unfolds in these little moments. Moments of stillness, humor, curiosity, even confusion.
I like that. And it ends by expressing the hope that Camblin's drawings will continue to challenge, amuse, unsettle, and inspire people, and ultimately bring them closer to that everyday enlightenment.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Bob Camblin, I think it's clear that his work, as seen in Buffalo Bayou and everything else we've discussed, is this incredible fusion of art and philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism.
Yes, absolutely. And his life, his choices, his embrace of collaboration and anonymity, they all point to this really unique perspective on art and the creative process. His work really encourages us to look beyond the surface, to question our perceptions, and to find meaning in the interplay of the seen and unseen.
And for those of you listening who love to learn, Camblin's journey is a great example of how different disciplines can come together to create something truly remarkable. And his emphasis on personal interpretation and challenging conventions might really resonate with you.
And this brings us to a final thought to leave you with. Considering Camblin's deliberate ambiguity and his belief that knowing too much can actually spoil things, how does this act of seeking understanding, like we've done today, affect our experience of art and the world? Is there a balance to be struck between analysis and just pure appreciation? That's something I'd like you all to ponder.
It is food for thought. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.